Okay, in this lesson we're going to create a low poly monitor, computer monitor. One of the things that we work with typically is something also called instance geometry. Now a monitor, for example, we would want to keep it low poly because it's typically going to be a redundant type object you'll find in your scene. Very common day to day, and it's a great starting object for when beginning box modeling. So go to your Create panel and make sure you're in geometry, which it typically is by default. And under the standard primitives object type rollout, you will find boxes. Go ahead and click on that. Navigate over to your top viewport, and the idea here is we want to create a if we're going to box model, the idea is that you find a piece of standard primitive that will typically represent the object that you're modeling. Even though it's called box modeling, doesn't mean we necessarily use a box, for example. Quite often, if we're modeling something more circular in shape, we would use, of course, a sphere. If it's like, for example, I know a lot of people prefer to start off with a cylinder when they're modeling bipedal characters, for example. So the idea is to find a primitive shape that represents as most closely as possible, just like figurative drawing, where we identify with basic shapes what it is that we're creating. For example, you'd use a triangle or a pyramid for a torso area, perhaps up in the shoulder area, or even in the pelvic area. Okay, with our box here, as you can see here, first thing we want to do is probably set up our scene so that it's more workable. For example, I prefer shutting off my grids when I model quite often, so I'm just going to go along and do that. And if you hit the letter G on your keyboard, and then just click on each viewport, you can activate that viewport and shut your grids off if you prefer. You don't have to. Then we'll center up our box here so that it's in the center of all our viewports, and we do that by hitting the Zoom Extents All button down on the lower right hand corner of the program. Okay, then what I prefer to do also, if you notice in our perspective viewport right now, I've got an edge overlay going on here on my model that I'm working with, and the selected object that I have is indicated by these little white bracket lines. For me, I find when I'm box modeling that those little bracket lines can actually get in your way. So I prefer to shut those off along with setting up the rest of the viewports. So why don't we go ahead and do that. Now you can access the viewport controls or configuration just by putting your mouse over one of the titles of the viewport, such as the word perspective here. I go ahead and I right click on that, and down at the bottom of the pop-up menu that comes along, I click on configure. In here, in the configuration dialog that pops up, you will find that you have on the right hand panel under the rendering options something that says use selection brackets. Why don't you go ahead and uncheck that, and we've already got edged faces checked in this case. If you don't, go ahead and check that, make sure that that's activated also. One other option you also have, if you want to make all your viewports solid view with an edged faces, you can also apply this to all viewports. So we can go ahead and say OK here, and we should be ready to work with our model now. Okay, so I've got this box here. One other thing I like to do, of course, is set up a measurement standard. For the future objects that you'll be modeling, you're going to be using a measurement system, and we want to set up max so that we can have that conform to that same measurement system. Now chances are you probably used feet and inches, so we'll go ahead and set that up to the US standard. If you put your mouse over the word customize up at the very top of the program, and click on that, and navigate down in the pop-up menu that comes up, and click on Unit Setup. It's about 3/4 of the way down, and click on that. And in the Unit Setup, as you can see here, I've already got mine set up. I have it clicked on US Standard, and it's under, with the drop-down menu there, we have feet with fractional inches. Now we do have some other choices in here, of course. We have feet with decimal inches, we have decimal feet, fractional feet, and decimal inches, and fractional inches. Not to mention the metric system, which of course the whole other world adheres to but us. We want to use feet with fractional inches, and the reason why I choose that is because when most people say like, for example, 3 3/4 of an inch, they'll use fractions to describe their parametric measurements, as opposed to saying 3.75 inches, which of course would be the same thing. Now right next to that we also have another drop down menu where it has fractions in that, and what this does is basically just sets your fractions to a common denominator. So for example, if I left that at 1/8 instead of being 2.5 inches, for example, it would read 2 4/8 inches. So it just rounds it to the most common denominator for you. In this case, I'll go with a 1/2 inch. That's the standard. We also have the default units, feet and inches. And what this indicates is if I were to type in something like 36, if I leave it at feet, it will indicate 36 feet. If I type in inches, it will automatically translate that over into 3 foot for me. So I'm just going to leave that at feet and say OK down here. And as far as my box goes, I've got that already set up. Just drag that out. Now remember, when you're creating a primitive object in 3D Studio Max, it's better to just simply create the object in the viewport at the top first, hopefully, so that your local coordinate system aligns with the world coordinate systems also. So along with that, we also want to then jump over to the modifier panel, and that way we can set up the box size. Now most monitors are typically no more than 2.5 feet, so we'll go ahead and change this down to 2 foot. We'll go 2 foot, and we'll say 2 foot 6 inches. And I can even highlight that and copy it if I want by right-clicking and choosing copy and highlighting over the next one for width and paste that in. Or you can of course just jump down and type them in as you wish. So I've got 2 foot 6 all the way around. That's roughly close to the overall width and shape. Now remember, that's about all I can do if I want to create like the size of a monitor. I can't alter this object in any way. It remains a cube. If I do want to alter this object, I have to then change it into an editable mesh. However, before I do that, there's a couple of things that I want to do to set it up in the future. So we're going to zoom around this by hitting our Zoom Extents All button again, just because we scaled it, and that should center up your object. And again, that's down in the lower right hand corner of the program under the viewport tools, and it's the 3D square with the 4 red cubes behind it. Go ahead and click on that, or 3D cube with the 4 red squares behind it, I should say. And once you've clicked on that and it's all centered up in all 4 viewports, one of the things in the idea of box modeling we try to do when we're setting up in advance for that is we think of the concept of what's called pre-segmenting. And the idea here is that we want to create enough segments in our object in order to create go ahead and just modify the object. So for example, most computer monitors will have like 3 segments that run the length, and under the height we can leave that just like it is, and then the width also we can leave that as it stands. Okay, now that we've got this set up here, and the reason why is because most of them taper down towards the back, as you will see here in just a minute. So the next step, what we need to do is we need to convert this over to an editable mesh or an editable poly. And we can go ahead and hit our modifier drop down list, and the reason why I like to do it via an edit mesh modifier is because it allows me access to all of the sub objects of a editable mesh. But in case I screw up or for whatever reason, and for myself later on, as you'll see, it's nice to jump back and forth between edit mesh and edit poly. Each one has its own tools and its own strengths. So as a game modeler, we jump back and forth between each one of them as we build a modifier list up. So as I was saying, just simply put right now, an edit mesh modifier does exactly the same thing as right-clicking over your model and choosing convert to editable mesh. The one advantage is that it does allow us to throw it away simply by hitting the little garbage icon right below the modifier list right here. And we can remove that modifier from the stack by clicking on that, as you can see here. or I can load one back up, simply put, and my object stays in place as it were. Simplifies things in the beginning, just so you don't have to go all the way back to the beginning and recreate your object. Okay, so once we've got our Edit Mesh modifier up here, you can see we've got a plus next to it. If you click on that, that allows us to have access to the different sub-objects to this object that we have now. I'll no longer refer to this as a box or a parametric object. To me, it's just a simple piece of geometry now. As you can see, we can go into vertex mode, and when you click on this, it also highlights down here under the selection with an icon. So you don't have to be in the modifier list. You can go by icon if you wish. And as you can see, it's got an indicator indicating right next to it which subgroup we're working on. Now, one of the powers of Max is you can actually have a sub-object group selected and apply a modifier above it and have it affect only those particular selected sub-objects, as you will see here in the future. But for today, what we're going to do is we're going to work with these vertices, and as you can see, when you go into vertex mode, it gives you for all the dots on the corners of your object here, and we're going to work in the left viewport, so go ahead and right-click on that to make it active. And once you've right-clicked on the left viewport, we want to navigate all the way over in the program to the maximized viewport option. This is right above your clock on your taskbar. Go ahead and click on that, and it should make your left viewport maximized. Now, the idea here when we pre-segmented this is so that we can create the tapers within our object. Now, we can go ahead and select draw a marquee around the extreme right-hand upper corner of vertices, and using our transform tools such as select and move, rotate, and scale, we can move these around and scale them and so on. And of course, the way you do that is you have your transform gizmo here, and you can grab a hold of it by the arrow key and move it in one direction at a time. If you want to move it down, you could do something like that. Of course, you can move it in 2 dimensions at a time, and I'll just undo those. And I can grab it by the 95-degree angle and just move that around also in 2 dimensions at a time. Now, the idea when we model quite often is to model like the side view first, get it roughed out, and then from there we go back to the front view and we make adjustments there, or one of the other views. So as you can see, we can pull some of these vertices down. Now, one of the things I need to point out, and I'm just going to jump out of the maximized viewport here for a second and show you in the perspective viewport, for example, when I made my selection in the left viewport, I drew a marquee around it, and that actually selected this one right here and also the one on the furthest side away from us. So it not only selected the one closest to us in the left view, but also the one behind it on the right side. So you have to be careful of that. Now, if you only want to select one at a time, we have an option for that under the right-hand panel of the modifier list called Ignore Backfacing. If you click on that, and that's available to all of the sub-objects we have. For example, if I'm in polygon mode and I don't want to select the back one, Ignore Backfacing is also available to me there. But so that works in every sub-object mode, and what that allows us to do is if I now draw a marquee in the left viewport, you will see over into the perspective view, observing over here that it only selected on the left-hand side of the model, but not on the right. That's because there is vertices directly behind that, and you got to keep that in mind when you're working with objects like this in a symmetrical view. Now, there are some other things that we also need to mention about low poly modeling. We as modelers and game designers only put vertices and edges where we really need it to support the geometry. So for example, you can see this edge here. This is a supporting edge for the shape, and this one right along here, that supports the overall shape. However, if I have a vertice point set right here in the middle and it doesn't change, for example, like right along here, this does me no good. Unless I'm going to use it later on for something else and I'm thinking in advance, I may not want to have that here. Now, one of the things I want to point out is we can't just simply go along and select a vertice and delete it, because you will lose your support of your geometry. So instead, what we do is we do something called welding our vertices, but we'll get into that a little bit later on. So in this case, we had this model and we pre-segmented in the left viewport here, and you can go ahead and grab like the lower right hand corner, excuse me. But we want to make sure we grab both of them, so go back and uncheck ignore back facing. So if you uncheck ignore back facing, you can now draw around the lower right hand corner vertices in the left viewport, and then grabbing it by the Y handle here, just put your mouse over the green arrow there, and it should turn to gold, and pull it up about a quarter of the way up your model, considering this is the minimum and again this is the maximum. And we can pull that up for the back of it, and we're going to do the same thing with this next row of vertices. However, we're going to do it a little bit different. I'm going to show you a little cheat because I'm lazy. If you go ahead and just draw a marquee around that whole row right there, so you have both the upper and lower sections, and then switch to your scale tool, it will take a common point, because if you look up here under the main toolbar, you have a little button over here indicating where you want to scale from, or move from, or rotate from. And we have a common point. It's the second one. If you go ahead and click on that, so that it uses a common point between your selection here, we can go ahead and just grab the Y handle and use that to scale. So we can go ahead and pull that down. And so you've got something like that. And then actually, I think we're going to scale these ones back up, so go ahead and grab them. It depends on your monitor shape. This is one monitor. Some monitors are more squared off, for example. I'm just going to go ahead and reselect these and switch back to my move tool. And of course you can freelance all that you need to with your monitor. You can grab, for example, all of these right in here and move them down. So you've got something more shapely, so it looks like a computer monitor. Now, some monitors, as you can see along the side here, are just flat across there. We can also use our scale to scale along the other dimension. This is where we would now come along in the front viewport, for example. But before we do that, we're going to select in the left viewport all 4 of the back vertices. And you should have 4 of them selected. Technically it's 8 because you have the back side also. So if we go ahead and select that and switch to our scale tool, and then right click in your front viewport to make it active, we can go ahead and scale that and taper that in a little bit. So that should create a little bit of a taper like most monitors typically have. Now again, this is just your most common standard monitor. And if you wanted more detail, you would round your edges. But because we're game designers, this is your first box model. The idea is to keep it simple. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to go down to our viewport tools and use our arc rotate button. Click on that and choose the white one, which allows us to use the pivot point of our selected objects. That's the arc rotate selected button now. And then if we right click in the perspective viewport, and then we have to click back on that because that deactivates it, and grab it by the 3 o'clock handle. Put your mouse right over that 3 o'clock handle so it turns into a 2-dimensional spinner, and rotate around to the front of your computer monitor. Okay, next what we're going to do is we're going to switch modes here and go from sub-object mode of vertex over into polygon. And we're going to build out our front frame for our computer screen. Now, we can use a texture, of course, to use as our display up here, but if you look at most computer monitors, including the one you're probably working on right now, it's actually got a frame area around the actual display area, and then it also has a little bit of a bevel inward to kind of inset that actual computer screen itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create that. Now we do that in the polygon mode. We've got some sub-object tools that we can use to work on this. Now 2 of the main tools that you're going to be using when you box model is something called bevel and extrude. During the last lesson you learned about extrusion of 2D shapes into a 3-dimensional object. We do this also at the sub-object level by grabbing a hold of things like the polygon and extruding it outward. So go ahead and click on your bevel tool. Now one of the differences between the bevel and the extrude is the bevel will acts as a extrude tool, but it also acts as a scale tool for a second click. So it's a 2-step option. It allows you to select a face, for example, and we'll select that front face, if you just single click on it, and then if you hold down your mouse button and push it forward while observing in all 4 viewports, you want to pull it forward just a little bit. Not a whole lot. Don't worry in case you pulled it way out. It doesn't really matter. If you don't let go of your mouse button, you still have control over this. If you did, it's still not a big deal because we can just switch to our move tool and move it back. Now when you let go of your mouse button, it automatically becomes a scale tool on that polygon. We want to just taper this down while observing in the left viewport or in the top, and just taper it down just slightly. Something like that. And then go ahead and left click again to end the process. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to switch to our move tool. And using our move tool, and I like to do this in the left viewport because it's easiest to see. As you can see here, I've got my red line which indicates my polygon I have selected. I want to take this line and I want to push it back so that it lines up with the next blue line to the right. And I do that by right clicking in the viewport. That way I don't lose my selection. And then I put my mouse over the X handle here, and it will turn with a yellow staff to it basically. And I hold down my left mouse button and I pull it back to the right until that lines up. And then I go ahead and let go of that. Okay, if you look over here under the perspective viewport now, you can now see that our new current selected polygon, we've just created new polygons, and as you can see here, we've created a smaller area, and we've got a frame area out here. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to use our bevel tool again, and we're going to just taper this inward now. So click on your bevel tool, put your mouse in the perspective view right over the center of that, hold it down, and then you want to push it back or pull it back towards you a little bit, about the same distance. Now I'm observing in my left and my top viewport here before I actually let go and commit. And remember, once you actually let go of the left mouse button, it now becomes a scale tool with the selected polygon. So we want to scale it down just a little bit more even to create that taper on the inside of our frame. So go ahead and let go of your mouse button and then pull your mouse back slightly while observing in the left and the top viewport. And then go ahead and single click again when you're satisfied with that. Okay, so there's our simple computer monitor. There is some other things we need to consider when we work on our geometry. And what that amounts to, if we go ahead and maximize the perspective view, we can go ahead and observe our model. Typically when we inspect our models and we do what's called optimizing or cleanup of our models, we go ahead and go into the perspective view and we rotate around and we look for errant things or issues that we may have to clean up. For example, this would be the stage of where we would clean up any extra vertices. As I said earlier, we actually had plans for these vertices. You can see how they support the geometry. So we need each one of these, and in that case it's very clean. We don't have to worry about getting rid of any extra vertices. However, we do have some visible edges when we extruded these faces. When Max creates new geometry, new polygons like this, it will create visible edges along its seams. Wherever you stop and let go of your button, it creates those new edges and they are visible. Now, just to show you and remind you that everything is still made up of triangles, we want to change up our model so that we can see those invisible triangles. So go ahead and right click in your perspective viewport, and then go ahead and right click again with your model selected, and this should bring up your quad menu. And again, it's called a quad menu because there are 4 quadrants to this. Down under the lower right hand quadrant, navigating down, you will find something called Object Properties. Go ahead and click on the Object Properties, and this will bring up some things that we can do, like displaying all the invisible edges. Now remember, as I said, everything is still made up of triangles, but the difference between a face and a polygon is what's visible and what isn't. So go ahead and uncheck the Edges Only button, and then say OK, down under the Object Properties. And if you go ahead and use your Arc Rotate tool now and rotate around, again put your mouse over like the 3 o'clock handle, and you can see all the triangles that are on here. Now again, this geometry is very clean. We got only one solid polygon here for detail. But in the front here, we do have some visible edges. If you right click and get out of your Arc Rotate tool, if you single click now on the top of where your frame you just created, you can see that it creates dividing lines, and these would be considered separate polygons. Because that is a visible edge, that's considered a separate polygon. Now if I were going to be putting a texture map on here, I would want it to have all four of these as one and just paste it on there. That way you get kind of a alpha channel showing up, or a transparency showing up right through the center. So I could use a photograph on here, or some custom texture such as a plastic or whatever have you. So what we need to do to get rid of that is we have to concentrate on these visible edges in here. And the way we do that is go over into the modifier list and click on edge mode. And then again, if we turn on the ignore back facing over here under the modifier list, that'll, in case we don't select any back ones behind here, we want to go along and select those four visible edges on the frame area. And the way you do that is you'll just click on one and it should turn red, and you hold down your control key on your keyboard and then put your mouse over the next one, and that should also turn red. And again, observe, making sure you're adding to it. Click on one of the other two, and then last but not least we'll click on that one also. So we've got our four edges selected here. And I think I just moved mine, so let me just right click. Nope, just all selection, so I'm okay. Now with those four edges that are visible selected, under the edit geometry rollout in the modifier, we want to navigate all the way down to the very bottom down here of the whole rollout till you find surface properties. Under surface properties, we have the option to make edges visible or invisible. Quite simply put, we're just going to make them invisible, so go ahead and click on that. Now I've got two more that turned up visible here. I'm going to click on that and make that invisible also. Now when I go back to polygon mode, it's going to have the original selection intact if I have one. If you do, just click off in space so it selects nothing, and then go ahead and re-click on that frame, and it should go all the way around. Now, two things this supports for. Again, if we want to actually apply a texture to it, where we have a visible edge is a cutoff range. Where we have an invisible edge, we'll apply it across that surface. Another thing it's handy for is if we want to continue beveling and extruding. For example, if I wanted to continue modeling, I could go into extrude and pull that out, or whatever have you. Now I of course don't want that, but hiding edges allows us to create custom geometry and shapes so that when we go ahead and extrude from them surfaces, we can go ahead and go from like a square to an octagonal shape, which we'll get into in the next couple models here. Okay, so there is our simple computer monitor. At this point you can go ahead and get out of sub-object mode. That's very important. Make sure you click on the word Edit Mesh. And if you prefer to save your model at this point with your Edit Mesh modifier intact, you can go ahead and choose File, Save As, and save your model. Or you can just right-click over your model and navigate down and collapse it. Now the reason why we collapse this is because these modifier stacks are custom only to, and they're proprietary to 3D Studio Max. If we want to export these models for a game engine, they do have to be collapsed down to an editable mesh. So I just click on Collapse All, and I do get a warning that comes up if you've never set the presets in Max that says you're going to remove everything in here and collapse it down. Now we know that's what we want to do, so in this case we're going to say yes. Now we've got another option over here to hold your model. A hold is a temporary save under Edit, which you can go and then choose Fetch also when you hold and fetch a model. It's a kind of a fail-safe for non-commitment to something. Now in my case, I know when I'm going to be collapsing my model, so I'm going to check Do Not Show This Message Again, so it don't continue to nag on me. And then I'll choose Yes, and it collapses itself down to an editable mesh. At this point, again, you can choose a file, Save As, and if you saved it with the list intact, you can save it as Computer Monitor. But before you actually click on the Save or Commit button here, click on the plus right next to the word Computer Monitor. This will allow you to create a new iteration of the file, meaning that you've got a fallback between the editable mesh and the editable mesh modifier. So there you go. That's how you can make a computer monitor, and that's your first introduction into box modeling.